Speaking of California, Mark Sanlow of the San Francisco Chronicle. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Steve. Good to be here.
A recall petition underway in California. ABC News last night pointing out that those who are supporting the initiative have about 600,000 signatures. They need 900,000 plus. Why is this happening?
Well, they're on their way. You know, in California, to collect signatures, it takes money, and they've got the money right now. They've got somewhere around $750,000. About 75 cents a signature is what people figures it takes. It's happening, Steve, because in some ways it's a perfect political storm. You've got, on the one hand, a state that is in a terrible recession. California has been at the back end of what's going on in this nation, and as the rest of the country begins to recover, California's not there yet. You've got a horrible electricity crisis a year ago that saw people's energy bills going up 5-10-fold, which of course gets people upset. Then you have a governor who, although he's been a survivor, he's been around for 30 years in California, nobody really likes him. And the combination of an unpopular governor, a terrible state fiscal crisis, and this electricity problem has given this governor unbelievable fits. And it looks at this point, I think they claim today they're up to about 700,000 signatures. They need 900,000 by September 2nd. Now, it's not to say the governor of California will be recalled, but at this point it certainly looks like a recall motion or a recall measure will be on the ballot.
Who is behind the effort?
Well, you got a lot of Republicans who are very frustrated in California. This is a state that Democrats control both houses of the state legislature. They have both U.S. senators, overwhelming Democratic congressional delegation, and they control every constitutional office in the state of California. Democrats rule in California. So you have a lot of frustrated Republicans. Right now there's a guy by the name of Darrell Issa, congressman from San Diego County, a self-made millionaire who has put in about $600,000 of his own money into this thing. Of course, he'd like to be perhaps the next governor of California, but you have a huge roster of frustrated Republicans in California who see this as sort of an easy way to the governor's seat.
There's a piece this morning inside the New York Times pointing out that no statewide recall has ever made it to the ballot, yet when Ted Costa, a conservative activist, launched the effort to recall Mr. Davis last February, barely a month after his second inauguration, few Californians expected it to succeed. What's changed from February through June?
Well, it's amazing. I actually brought a copy of our paper here, which maybe you can show. This is just from this week, this San Francisco Chronicle. I think most Californians were caught by surprise with this recall. They had heard about it, but it's not till the front page of papers like ours this week that start pointing out that these signatures are coming on. These guys are standing outside Targets, they're standing outside, drugstores. They've just been steadily picking up signatures. What changed in the last couple of weeks has been money, Steve. Suddenly, Darrell Issa, this congressman from San Diego County, put in all this money, and suddenly it's clear that the recall election is going to have the money behind it to at least collect those signatures. You know, you see those good folks standing outside drugstores looking for signatures, and although the populist notion from the turn of the century is that these are angry men and women who want to throw the governor out, and there are those people. A lot of these folks are getting paid 50, 75 cents, even $1 a signature to collect these things. So if you have enough money behind it, you can collect signatures for anything. And good luck going to California and finding somebody who says, you know, I really like Gray Davis. Yeah, they voted for him, and they've elected him lieutenant governor and controller and now governor twice. But this is not a popular politician. So when you say, hey, you want to throw the bums out, people like to say yes. And I think it's not that hard to at least collect signatures to put it on the ballot.
A lot of Republicans felt that Bill Simon didn't have a chance in last year's election, and yet when the results came in, it was a lot closer than a lot of people expected.
Yeah, Bill Simon came out of nowhere. He was the son of the old Treasury Secretary, this guy who had never run for political office before in his life. Bill Simon is a guy who was completely written off in the polls. No one took very seriously. I guess if Yogi Berra were still alive, Yogi Berra would say, had that election been any closer, it wouldn't have been so close. Because although Bill Simon came within 5 or 6 points of Gray Davis, it's because no one thought he had a chance. Democrats were not motivated. If Democrats had actually thought that Gray Davis would lose that election, they probably would have shown up in hordes. And I think Gray Davis would have won that election by more. California is a very, very Democratic state. You can put up a terrible Democratic candidate against an awful Republican, against a great Republican candidate, and you might have a very close election. But a lot of Republicans looked at that election last year with Bill Simon so close, and they thought, well, if Bill Simon can do it, then a good candidate can knock off the Democrat.
Our guest is Mark Sanlow, who is the Washington Bureau Chief for this publication, the San Francisco Chronicle, and last Wednesday on its front page is a photograph of Mike Todd as he gathers the signature for the Recall Governor Gray Davis campaign. And you'll notice he's wearing a T-shirt that's called recallgraydavis.com. This is what the website looks like if you want to log on and get more information and join in our conversation. For those of you who support the recall effort or the idea of recalling a governor, give us a call at 202-585-3880. If you're opposed to this, 202-585-3881. If you're watching outside the United States on the BBC Parliamentary Channel or elsewhere, 202-585-3883. And our email address is journal@cspan.org. Let's just spend a moment to talk about the mechanics of this. And you point out in this front page story from Wednesday, 700,000 signatures. Organizers say that they've collected 900,000 signatures needed to force a recall, and 200,000, the number of signatures that Davis supporters say that they've collected opposing a recall. Can you explain?
Yeah, let me explain how this works. If you get 900,000 signatures, and I think that is 12% of the people who voted in the last election is where that number comes from, a recall measure goes on the ballot. Now, it's very simple. Should Governor Gray Davis be recalled or some such language on the ballot? It's a very simple yes or no. But here's where it gets interesting. Next to that will be a list of people who, if the governor is recalled, would replace him. Now, here's what it takes to get your name on that ballot. You need either 10,000 signatures, which in a state of 33 million people is not that hard to get, or you need 65 signatures and a $3,500 filing fee. Now, $3,500 is not a whole lot of money in today's politics. What that means is, and this is very possibly going to happen in California, perhaps this fall, maybe next year for the primary election, you're going to have a ballot. It says yes or no on Gray Davis, and then you're going to have a list of maybe 20 or 25 candidates, all of whom want to replace Gray Davis. Now, there's no runoff here. There's no party conventions. There's no primary. You put up the money, you're on the ballot, and it doesn't take a majority to win. It just takes a plurality. So that, you know, if Steve Scully decides, and I don't believe that there's any residency requirement, if you decide you want to move to California, dish out the money and get your name on the ballot. People say, I've seen him on TV, seems like a reasonable fella. You end up with 15% of the vote. That could be enough to make you governor of California. In the words of Dan Schnurr, who's a leading California political consultant, this is as close to political anarchy as any of us are likely to witness in our lifetime, which for political reporters, let me add, is like a full employment act, because this is like the World Series in January. This is an off-election year in California, and the state is just waking up to the fact that this may be the most raucous campaign year in memory.
Prop 13 received an awful lot of attention, and since then there seem to be more and more of these types of questions on the ballot, and now a recall effort in California. Why does California have this type of system in place, where many other states don't?
You know, I think it's about 18 states right now have this. You have to go back to 1921 in the state of North Dakota. A guy by the name of Lynn Fraser, which I have to admit I had to look up to be able to say that because I didn't know this, was a governor who was recalled. It's the last U.S. governor recalled. This guy Fraser went on to serve 17 years in the Senate, so it wasn't a political death sentence for him. California, the question people always ask is it cutting edge or is it crazy? And no one really knows the answer to that. I know there are folks in Washington who believe that if this passes in California, state houses, you know, from Carson City to Columbus will be trembling with fear because they say, uh-oh, Prop 13 led to this wave across the country. Perhaps a recall in California will lead to a similar wave. But there are other academic folks who look at this and say, look, California has got this terrible combination of problems that are very, very unique to the state right now. The economy stinks. The governor is unpopular. When you got those two things together, these can boil up into this. And there aren't a whole lot of states where a governor who was elected less than 1 year ago, and by a margin of, it's only 5 or 6 percentage points, but in California, that's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of votes that a newly reelected governor, who's not accused of any crime, who's not accused of any malfeasance besides raising taxes, which of course is an offense to a lot of people, is actually going to talk about being recalled. So we'll see if it happens elsewhere, but California's successes do tend to be repeated around the country.
By the way, if you have the Washington Post, there is an article about San Francisco's economy and how it's faring in light of the so-called .com crash. We'll get our first call from California. Stockton, go ahead, please.
Hello, this is Steve in Stockton. You there?
Yes.
Okay. I'm an attorney out here, and I make a pretty good living, but my power bills in the last year have gone up to around $500 a month. Now they want to increase the sales tax. They want to triple the amount of money I have to pay to license my car. And I think really the foundation of this revolt against Gray Davis is just the huge amount of spending that has gone on in his administration, and I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be voting for this for their pocketbooks. They're angry about it, and like I'm angry about it. These power bills are just outrageous out here.
Well, I commend you for being up at an ungodly hour on the West Coast in order to call us up. I mean, it's true that the fiscal crisis in the state is incredible. I mean, think of this. There's a $38 billion projected deficit coming up. Now, these billions get tossed around. It doesn't mean much to people. But we're not talking about the federal government here. We're talking about the state government. For a state of 33 million people, that means if every man, woman, and child in California were to pitch in $1,000, you still wouldn't have enough money to balance the budget next year. So what Gray Davis has done is a combination of tax increases, spending cuts, and then some, sort of playing with the numbers some to try to balance that budget. Now, that's not a formula that makes a lot of people happy. The question is what the alternative is. Now, clearly, you could not raise taxes, but in order to not raise taxes, you have to significantly decrease services. California, a couple decades ago, was considered to have one of the finest school systems in the country. Today, it ranks near the bottom in terms of student achievements, in terms of spending on teacher salaries, and there's a lot of folks in California who simply don't want to see services cut. So you got a choice. It's not the federal government where you can borrow money indefinitely. The budget must be balanced. Gray Davis has chosen a budget path which has angered both sides. I think the people are very, very upset about the services he wants to cut, which is why there's some Democrats who are unhappy with him, and there's an awful lot of Republicans who are furious about the fee increases that you mentioned, and of course that's one of the reasons his political future is in danger.
The projected deficit in California, what is it right now?
$38 billion, which, like I say, in Washington, $1 billion doesn't seem like that much money. $38 billion for a single state is just an astronomical amount of money.
Jamaica, New York, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I'm opposed to the what is it? The outing of the governor of California. I'm opposed to that because I don't hear anything that he's done so wrong. He hasn't broken any laws. He hasn't done anything any different than what George Bush has done. Is the economy for the whole country is a wreck, and nobody's trying to oust George Bush.
Well, the recall, which was something that put into the California Constitution almost 100 years ago, back in the progressive era of Hiram Johnson, it wasn't necessarily aimed at people who break the law. This was back in the era where there was concern that the special interests had taken over the state houses, and the concern was that while there were impeachment proceedings, it's very possible the state legislatures were just as corrupt as the governor. So I think this was aimed at corruption, not necessarily law-breaking, if they can make a distinction. You make a point that a lot of Californians do. This governor is not even accused of breaking any laws. At the same time, the recall measure, the recall guidelines, which are in the state constitution, don't demand that anybody broke any laws. This is not an impeachment proceeding. It's not a criminal proceeding. This is simply the popular will. It's a populist measure from 100 years ago. If you collect the signatures and if you vote the guy out under California's Constitution, he's gone. And if he does get voted out, I have a feeling there'll be some Democrats who will think about amending that piece of the Constitution.
Last Sunday in the Los Angeles Times, this editorial, California loses in a recall. Is Governor Gray Davis anyone's favorite politician? No, not in this lifetime. But let's think for a moment about the potential consequences of the recall effort building against him. The LA Times points out that supporters have until September 2nd to collect the 900,000 signatures needed to put the issue on the ballot. The editorial goes on to say that an inexperienced mischief maker could become governor, and concludes that there is no honest cause for undoing an election that occurred 7 months ago. The risk of putting the state into a deeper fiscal hole and partisan political chaos is too great. Californians might want to think twice before signing a recall petition thrust in their faces by a paid signature gatherer. Let's get a call from Los Angeles. Good morning, a supporter of the recall effort. Go ahead, please.
Hi, good morning. How are you guys?
Fine, thanks.
Well, you know, I think this is actually just the beginning, because it seems to me that our entire state house has been completely taken over by special interests. And to start with Gray Davis, we basically hold him responsible for squandering billions and billions and billions of our tax dollars. And I think that after we're done with Gray Davis, I have a feeling that the people in the State House are all of a sudden going to find themselves out of a job.
Thank you. Mark Sandlow?
You know, there's, I guess the question I'd have is, do you also blame George W. Bush for squandering, you know, several $1 trillion surplus? Economic conditions change. I don't say this out of any sort of pointed defense of Gray Davis, because there are clearly other ways he could have handled the fiscal crisis. The problem is, whatever governor won the last election was going to be in trouble. The state is hurting. The state is hurting badly. So I think it's understandable that there is anger towards the governor. I think it's also understandable the governor says, hey, I've done the best I could. It's interesting. You go back, I guess it would be 8 years now, and look at Governor Pete Wilson, who was a Republican, who also talked about raising taxes. And there was an awful lot of anger at him, particularly in his own party. Now, Wilson rode it through. He did a combination of a lot of belt tightening. As a matter of fact, he wrote it out so well that he actually had visions that maybe he could become president of the United States, which he quickly learned was not going to happen. But California governors, in terms of being in the pockets of special interest, is something that the accusation's been around for a long, long time. I think the state legislature has a terrible reputation in terms of its independence. I mean, it was 15 years ago, the Speaker of the House, Willie Brown, who's now mayor of San Francisco, actually made money consulting cigarette companies in New York about how to pass bills through his own state legislature. It was legal, but it stunk. And I think that a lot of people have always thought of that of the California legislature. And I think it's part of the anger that you're expressing that is now showing itself in this recall movement.
One political side note, did I read this past week that former Governor Pete Wilson is considering running for the Senate again?
It's been talked about. It's actually a columnist, Deborah Saunders, for my paper, the San Francisco Chronicle, who floated this idea a couple months ago. And no one had really put it on the radar screen, but no one shot it down either. It's talked about. Pete Wilson has absolutely talked to people about taking on Barbara Boxer, who is long thought to be one of the most liberal and therefore vulnerable senators sitting in Washington now. I think Pete Wilson at this point is probably not going to do it, but it speaks to the Republican problem in California right now. The bench is very, very weak. You cannot read an article about this recall movement and have any name out there that anybody has heard of across the country, except for two. There are two names that keep getting mentioned. One is Condi Rice. That's the National Security Advisor. Now, Condi Rice was the provost at Stanford University, impeccable credentials. Who could argue with her knowledge of world affairs and, you know, with her ability to run things? Condi Rice has a political future in California. She has talked about how she would like to be governor of California privately to people. But now is probably not the time for her to do it. She just told a forum in Los Angeles this week. She's in the middle of pretty intense things here in Washington. She's not coming back for the recall. But the other popular name that people have heard of, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator. Arnold Schwarzenegger has a movie coming out in a couple weeks, Terminator 3. I think it's called Terminator 3, The Rise of the Machines, which people have joked, the rise of machine sounds like the life story of Gray Davis. But that gets to another matter. Arnold Schwarzenegger is serious about this. He says that after the movie comes out, I think it's a couple of weeks from now, he will make an announcement about whether he is intending to run for governor, not only in the future, because people thought he might run to replace Gray Davis, but maybe even in this recall measure. So, like I say, this is a political story that just does not stop giving to reporters, and it's very hard to read a story about this without seeing Schwarzenegger's name in it.
Howard Kalougian is the chairman of the Recall Gray Davis campaign. He is in Michigan this morning, but lives in Sacramento and is joining us on the phone to discuss this effort. Mr. Kalougian, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you. Good morning, and happy Father's Day to everybody.
Why are you doing this?
Well, that's a good question. I'd like to correct, though. I live in San Diego.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's quite all right. But to answer your question, you know, every time I look at California's future, whether it's from energy to water or taxes or traffic, I see difficulty ahead, and it's all because of the policies, the failed policies of Governor Gray Davis. And I love California too much to not fight for it. A couple of assumptions that I think your discussion so far has had that isn't actually correct is that revenues have gone down in the state of California, making it difficult to make these budget choices. That's not true. Revenues are up year over year from when Governor Gray Davis first took office 4 years ago till today. Revenues are up 28%. That's even after the dot-com bubble. That's after the stock market crash. That's after the economy has turned south, after the one-time capital gains taxes have gone down because nobody's got any capital gains in the stock market anymore. Revenues are up.
So
and when you look
what
at
resulted in this $38 billion deficit?
Pardon me?
What resulted in this $38 billion deficit?
His spending is out of control, and he hasn't spent anything that he can point to and say, look, I built this freeway, or I built this bridge, or I built this dam. There hasn't been a ribbon-cutting ceremony for his spending. It's all been wealth transfer payments. And in fact, here's a point that most people probably are unaware of nationwide. We've had a hiring freeze over the last year of Gray Davis's administration because he knew that his spending was getting out of control. And so during the hiring freeze, he hired 28,000 state employees. And so he's been spending money in areas where there just isn't a need to spend money. And today, because even though he's got this crisis on his hands, he refuses to let go of those state employees. He finds that they are no longer something that's a luxury, but a necessity.
Why did you decide to serve as chairman of this recall effort?
Well, I am a private citizen in California, and I am not looking forward to the future that he has built. His spending addiction has caused the state to near bankruptcy, and he's increasing our taxes and fees across the board and deciding to burden our children with long-term debt. And his solutions are terrible, and they are problems that he's created. And it's not the legislature. Those folks have been there a long time. You know, John Burton is the head of the Senate. He's been in the legislature for a couple of decades. John Vasconcellos, who used to be the Democrat head of the Budget Committee, has been there for decades. These people have been there a long time, but this is the first governor who's never been able to hold them in check.
For sake of argument, share with you from the LA Times editorial this past Sunday, a week ago, that California loses in a recall, and in essence, one of the points is that this is going to create a political disaster for the state and only worsen the financial problems for California.
Well, it's really quite funny to hear the papers that endorsed him for governor now try to defend him. Usually they end up writing something like, yes, we know he's corrupt, and yes, we know he's competent, but gee, you know, he's our governor, so we should keep him. The truth of the matter is we have a political crisis. This is the solution. Because of the recall, the policies that he's begun to propose have begun to change already. The legislature is going to be put on notice that they cannot have business as usual once this recall occurs.
Who do you want to see as the next governor of California?
Well, I think that that's going to be up to the people of California. Amongst the people that they'll be able to choose from will be a long list of Democrats and several Republicans. Of course, Congressman Darrell Issa has been demonstrating the leadership to come forward and help the recall finish up. It started as a pure populist volunteer effort, and we were well on our way to gathering several 100,000 signatures just through volunteerism alone. We had already crossed the 100,000 mark. Mm-hmm. And Darrell Issa, a congressman from Southern California, decided to come in and help finance it. And so he's demonstrated some leadership for the state, and perhaps he deserves our support.
And let me ask you one other question. Why would anyone want it, based on the problems that you and Mark Sandlow have outlined?
Yes, it's very difficult in circumstances if you don't have any leadership qualities. And if you decide that you're just going to let the problem accumulate, as Gray Davis has the past 3 years. In fact, he keeps pushing forward the deficits from year to year. And next year, even after the $38 billion budget deficit it has been dealt with, he's projecting that under his best-case scenario, he's going to have another $10 billion to start the next fiscal year with. And so there are some very difficult decisions to be made, but there are programs and plans out there, such as what's been proposed by the Reason Foundation, that will solve our budget crisis within 18 months without a single tax increase.
Say, Mr. Colosi, Mark Sandlow, if I could jump in with a question, I guess what I want to know is the parameters that you put on this, and I don't dispute anything you said, but have been out there for a bit. I mean, Gray Davis's attitude towards government spending is something that's been obvious for years, and he's in his second term of governor. He was sworn in January for his second term. And I guess the question, you know, the fiscal crisis has been looming for years now. What changed from the time that you decided to launch this in the spring from January that made you think that when voters went to the polls last November, they didn't get it enough, that they need another opportunity just maybe 8 or 9 or 10 months later?
Question, Mark. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk about this, because actually last year, during the one and only gubernatorial debate between Gray Davis and his Republican challenger, the Republican challenger said that the budget deficit was going to be at least $20 billion. And Gray Davis scoffed at that, laughed at it, and said, no, we solved the budget problems with last year's budget that they only enacted in September, and there won't be a budget crisis in the future, and there's going to be no need for a tax increase in the future. Days after the election, days later, he said, oh my goodness, I'm surprised. We're going to have a budget deficit, and it's going to be, at that time, $34 billion, and it's going to require tax increases. So the governor, who's in charge of the financial departments that reveal that information, covered up the information until the election, and that's what angered most people in California. Not that we have the problem, but that he lied about it for his own pure political ambition of getting reelected. And so now that he's revealed this problem, that he's delayed and deferred until now, we don't like the solutions he's proposing, and we want to invoke the lemon law here in California and revisit the issue of who should be our leader.
Howard Kalougian, who is joining us on the phone from Michigan, lives in San Diego, a former member of the California Assembly and the chair of the Recall Gray Davis Committee. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Scott.
Next call is from Los Angeles. Good morning.
Good morning. I am definitely against this recall. I'm a firefighter here in the Los Angeles County area, and this governor has been very supportive of public safety. This recall is going to put us in chaos. It's going to cost us taxpayers money, and it's going to put us deeper and deeper. I don't understand why, and I'm a Republican supporting a Democratic governor, and I don't understand why we voted for this governor. He's in place. Let's support him. Let's get our problems solved and move ahead. Our economy is going to suffer. My wife is a small business owner. I mean, we're all going to get through this if we pull together. Let's don't play ball and go home. Let's work on our problems. And I don't understand why people like Howard is out there, you know, bashing our governor. It takes a team effort from all of us to get these things through and make our economy strong again. We just can't blame one person. It's more than just one person that's running our government here in California.
Thank you, caller. We'll get another view. We are talking about the recall effort now underway in California with about 700,000 signatures for the 900,000 plus needed for the recall effort. That the deadline is September 2nd, according to Mark Sandelow, who is the Washington bureau chief for the San Francisco Chronicle. Our next call is from Pittsburgh, a supporter of the idea. Good morning.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Sandelow. Yeah, I'm for it because if anybody's in there and they're not doing their job, I think it's just like if you hire a person and he's working for you, and 2 or 3 months goes by and this guy's falling down on the job. You either lay him off or you fire him or you try to straighten him out. Let me ask you a question. These signatures, how do they check these signatures? I mean,
it's a good question. It's a live issue because when you hand in petitions, I mean, 900,000 of them is an enormous stack. Typically what happens is you take a random sample of them. You know, you take a couple thousand, and people from the Secretary of State's office in California will go through and verify. They'll phone people. They'll make sure that they are registered voters. They'll make sure the addresses are legit. They take a random sample, and from that they try to determine whether or not the whole batch is good or not. Now what that means is 900,000 signatures is not enough, because there clearly are going to be some that will be thrown out. People sign ridiculous names to them. So I think the goal is to collect, 1.2, 1.3 million signatures. But, you never know whether or not they're legit, but there are ways to check them. You calling from Pittsburgh, PA, or Pittsburgh, CA?
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
If you want to get more information on this, by the way, you can log on to the San Francisco Chronicle website. It is linked to C-SPAN's website at cspan.org or sfgate.com. Art Torres is joining us on the phone. He's the chairman of the California Democratic Party to get his perspective on this recall effort. Mr. Torres, thanks for being with us.
You bet.
Can you give us your side of this whole effort? Governor Davis in the past has kind of dismissed this as a political charade.
Well, it is a political charade because it started in February when I attacked the White House and they denied it, but we all know that Karl Rove is behind this strategy, number one. Number two, it's an 0-4 strategy for the president to try and put in a Republican governor in the hopes that he can win California for the White House in 0-4. It's not going to happen. Number three, collusion and others who argue that this governor has somehow was a psychic and knew exactly what the deficit was going to be a month ahead or even 2 days ahead is really unbelievable. It reminds me of Dan Burton shooting watermelons in his backyard to prove that Vince Foster didn't commit suicide. We have all these urban legends that are going around by the far right in California trying to figure out just how they can win back an election they lost fair and square over 7 months ago. And to the tune of 25 to 40 million are the estimates that we've been hearing. I mean, you could hire 1,200 new teachers with that amount of money, not to mention 1,000 new firefighters to help us here in California, not to mention a number of other factors that we could fund with the money that's going to be wasted on a recall election. American government and the democratic process relies upon fair and square elections, and if you don't agree with someone or you don't agree with a candidate, you come back 2 years later or 4 years later and try to defeat them.
But you would argue that this is part of the California Constitution, and so what they're doing is legitimate within the state of California.
To make it right, the recall provisions that were put into place in 1910 don't even give the same protections to a governor that the President of the United States has. I mean, can you imagine the Republicans now saying that George Bush should have known because of his tax cuts and his economic policies that we're now reaching close to $5 trillion in deficit? Should he be blamed? Should he be impeached because he, quote, didn't know how much he was going to cost us?
Art Torres, again, for the sake of argument, from your standpoint, assuming that the recall effort is successful in getting the question on the ballot in October, what happens next for the Democratic Party and for Governor Davis in the recall campaign?
Taxpayers are going to be the victims of this far-right charade and political meddling, which is just absurd. We're going to be faced with even more deficits, and now we're having $35 billion in terms of a deficit here in California, which isn't the governor's fault, isn't collusion's fault, isn't the Republicans' fault. It's part of the economy that we're hurting here in California.
But how would this result in a higher deficit?
Well, let's just add 25 to 40 million that this special election will cost and figure it out.
Okay. Mark Sandlow?
Yeah, Mr. Torres, quick question for you. I mean, you've got a very intense political calculation to make here, because while Democrats could rally around Gray Davis and say, you know, we're going to boycott this thing, don't sign the petition and don't put your name to replace him, you leave yourselves obviously vulnerable to the possibility that you have a yes or no on the recall, and then right next to it a list of Republicans who are going to replace him, and if the recall wins, the Republican takes over. What do Democrats want to do in terms of putting their name?
What the issues are. People in California win elections based on the issues. You have to be for a woman's right to choose in this state, and any of the Republicans that are being put forward, Darrell Issa, who was allegedly convicted of grand theft auto, to McClintock, the other conservative senator, who believes that women who seek abortions are, quote, in his quotes, winos lined in the gutter, breast cancer patients who need support were voted against by this guy. When people figure out where the issues are and where all these other candidates are from the far right that have not been successful in winning statewide elections, I think we're going to prevail, because Californians are going to figure out that these wackos are out of step with where the majority of Californians are on the environment, on guns, on health care.
Let me just, let me just ask, assuming that this does qualify, and at this point you got to concede there's a very good possibility that whether it wins or not, it's very likely to be on the ballot. But if it's on the ballot, will Democrats put names on that ballot to become the next governor of California?
This election is not about Gray Davis. The election is about the future of California and the leadership that we believe in and where they stand on the issues.
But Art, one last time, because you're not answering my question here. Are Democrats going to try to leave their names off the ballot, or are Democrats going to stand up?
The issues will prevail. Whether there's a recall or not, we're going to face the recall if there is a recall. If there isn't, there isn't. It doesn't matter to me. The issues are what's at stake here. The values and principles of where the majority of Californians stand are totally out of sync with these right-wing extremists who are trying to recall this governor. They do not believe in a woman's right to choose. They don't believe in protecting the environment. They want to have offshore drilling off our coast. That's where Democratic candidates have prevailed in this state because they are right on the issues with the majority of Californians.
And one last point, Mr. Torres, how do you know that Karl Rove is behind this effort?
Oh, I know he is. And I know the White House is, because they want to make sure they defeat Barbara Boxer. They want to make sure that George Bush wins the White House with the help of California, which will not happen. He lost by 1.3 million votes in 2000 because he is out of sync again, and any Republican candidate that comes against Barbara Boxer is going to be out of sync with the majority of Californians. And this recall effort is a way to help organize the far right and the Republican Party, because basically they're prehistoric here in the state.
Art Torres, who is a former state senator in California, joining us from San Francisco, the chairman of the California Democratic Party. Thank you for being with us.
You bet. Good night.
Good night. Good morning. Early out in California. Saint-Tropez in France is our next caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I wanted to say exactly what the former speaker said about Mr. Baxter, who was murdered, to my opinion, and thanks to the internet, we know all that in France also. And I guess that it is it's not the Democrats who made the mistakes in California, but it is the commission of Mr. Cheney and all these extra computers Enron used. That's it.
Thank you. This email from A. Stevenson says, this is not about Gray Davis. It is about Republicans wanting absolute power in the United States. They are using their money to buy their way into government. You stated people standing outside drugstores collecting signatures could be paid about 75 cents a signature. Republicans used Enron to bankrupt California. President Bush did nothing to help the state. What do you think of this? Also, can Gray Davis be a candidate in the recall, allowing his supporters to cancel out their votes of all that they believe he should be removed from office? A majority might favor recalling Davis, but a plurality of the voters might support him.
I love the idea of having a recall on the left hand of your ballot saying, yes, I want to recall Gray Davis, and then the right-hand side saying, but I vote for Gray Davis to be the next governor. I don't think that's possible, but it raises an interesting question. And if you listen to the chairman of the Democratic Party, you can understand what an unbelievable political quandary Democrats are now in, because Democrats understand that Gray Davis is now popular. But Gray Davis did just win re-election. It is, as Art Torres says, a very Democratic state. But here's your problem. If Democrats don't like Gray Davis all that much, and Republicans can't stand him, there's a chance he loses the recall. Now, that forces that second half of that ballot, where that ballot is going to give a list of people who might replace him. If Democrats don't jump on that ballot, and it's a list of nobody but Republicans, then there will be a Republican who will be the next governor of California. So what do? It's, let's say you're Senator Dianne Feinstein, who's probably the most popular politician in the state of California. Now, Feinstein says she's against a recall. Terrible idea, she says. But does that mean that she doesn't put her name forward on the ballot? If Feinstein were to be on the ballot, it's very, very likely that whether Gray Davis beats off the recall, staying in office, or whether he loses a recall, a Democrat remains in power, because Dianne Feinstein would likely then be his replacement. It's one reason why Karl Rove, if he is behind, I don't know if he is taking a hell of a gamble here, because he's talking about replacing an unpopular Democrat and taking the risk it might be replaced with a popular Democrat. So the political machinations here are endless, and so I say it's an unbelievably interesting election. One last bit of numbers to keep in mind. If this recall gets the 900,000 necessary signatures by, I believe it's July 18th, that'll force a special election in September or October. Now, that's a special election. People who show up for special election tend to be the most motivated voters only. Now, if they collect them a couple months later, it would be kicked off till next year's elections, when Democratic primary voters are likely to be out in force voting for a presidential primary. Gray Davis is likely to do much better. If they can collect these signatures within about 30 days of now, there'll be a special election in September and October. It'll be probably a very low turnout election, and anything could happen.
Our guest is Mark Sandelow, who is the Washington bureau chief for the San Francisco Chronicle. We're talking about the recall effort in place in California. The petitions continue to be circulated across the state. Mr. Sandelow has been the Washington bureau chief since 1996. He's a native of Michigan. Our next call is from San Francisco. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I'm an independent. I've lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, came up here in 1965. And it's really funny to see the San Francisco Chronicle being represented here. And didn't you guys ask us to vote for Davis on your editorial page? This whole newspaper, I mean, you guys are part of this whole thing that's happened to us. It's just a lie that this is some kind of conspiracy out of Washington. What has happened to our state is it belongs to you, the Chronicle. It belongs to Gray Davis and all of the Democrats and this Willie Brown. And it's you guys are entrenched. You've been here since the 60s now. And you've taken this state over and you've destroyed it. In a city like Oakland, we've got a slaughter going over here in the East Bay, and you know that. Blacks are being killed. I mean, back in the days when I was at UC Berkeley and I went into the poli-sci department, Mr. Johnson, Democrat, was sprinkling billions over the ghettos. Remember that?
Thanks for the call. We'll get a response.
You know, you're right. Chronicle's been around since the 1860s, not the 1960s. They've been around for a long time. I sort of agree with you about the conspiracy. I'm not sure there's any conspiracy in Washington to get rid of Gray Davis. I think the White House has at this point shown that everything it touches in California, it's sort of the opposite of the Midas touch. You know, it's destroyed. So I don't think that Rove at this point is necessarily behind it. But I can guarantee you, there's no media conspiracy to stand up for Gray Davis either. You're absolutely right. The Chronicle editorial board endorsed Gray Davis. They've come out against the recall. You've seen the copy of the LA Times, which did the same thing. But whether the media is competent enough to engage in a conspiracy and whether they're willing to do so or not, I can tell you as a fact that in terms of my coverage, in terms of my colleagues' coverage, there's no conspiracy there.
Huntington Beach, California, in the southern part of the state. Go ahead, please.
Hi, very honored to be on C-SPAN. Thank you. I just wanted to say that liberals need to wake up. In 1998, they tried to impeach a liberal Democratic president. In 2000, we had a liberal Democratic president who won the popular vote, probably won the vote in Florida, who was taken away by the Supreme Court. And now the Republicans, who could not find a decent candidate to run in 2002, are now going to try to do a coup d'etat in California. And liberals really need to wake up. Pete Wilson was the one who signed the electricity deregulation bill, and that is probably the beginning of our problems. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll get another view from Pasadena, Texas. Good morning. You support the recall effort?
You bet. And that guy that just spoke before was a liar. There's nothing wrong with deregulation of electricity, but when you bind up one end of it and open up the other end, all you do is make a big sock. Anyway, I thought Mr. Torres' comment about taking the $25 million and wasting it on more government programs was hysterical. You know, that's the thinking. You know, we don't need to cut taxes. We need to just spend more money. If we just pay, just say $250,000 a year, we'll have the most brilliant students in the world. That's not going to happen.
Thank you. Thank you, caller. Highland, California. You have the next comment. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I completely oppose this. I'm a native Californian. I remember when Reagan was governor, that if they were so concerned about the state, they wouldn't be putting us through this with this you know, as he's just saying, with the amount of money that's going to be spent simply in verifying the signatures. You know, once you verify the signatures, then you have to, you know, if they do have the special election, you know, even if they don't have the special election, I mean, especially if they have the special election, you know, and we could have, you know, we don't know who would be the next governor. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. And as far as the energy bills, yeah, I'm pissed off about my energy bill, pardon my language, but, you know, I blame Enron for that. That wasn't the governor's fault.
Thank you. And one more call before we get a comment from our guest from San Diego. Your view on this?
Good morning. It's so early in the morning today, and I heard Art Torres' comment, and he just convinced me to support this bill. Where can I go to sign up?
Why? Why did he convince you?
The way he just dodged Mark's question. I do believe that the Democratic Party in the state, and I'm an independent, and actually I didn't vote, they just have taken control, and I think that's just too much power. And after he dodged Mark's question, it just kind of put a thought in my mind. Maybe we do need to upset the apple cart.
Thank you. Mark Stanlow, 4 calls, 3 from California, 1 from Texas.
You know, I continue to be amazed that people are up this early in California talking about it. It is on people's minds. I think that it is a lot of money to spend. I think our Torres is right. You don't want to throw money away. At the same time, it is not a coup d'etat in the sense that a coup d'etat is some sort of overthrow of a government. This is within the means of government. This is Hiram Johnson back in 1910 put these measures in place, crusaded for these measures so that the people could do this. Now, it's a real balance here between sort of mob or majority rule, depending on how you look at it, and trying to overthrow a governor who's done absolutely nothing illegal, and the public's right to be able to choose who they want. And I thought I was very interested in a comment made by Mr. Kalugian, who says that this has already had an impact in the way the Democrats are governing. Now, he suggested that Democrats, with the fear of this recall, looking over their shoulder, have somehow tempered their own behavior. And to the extent they've done that, I can't say they have. That's a very interesting phenomenon. There is a flip side to that. The California budget is due in a couple of weeks, and they are nowhere near finishing out in the state legislature. There is some thought that there are Republican legislatures who are willing to drive the budget off a cliff in the hopes that the fiscal train wreck will encourage people to blame the governor and sign the recall petition. So it could affect behavior in both ways.
Last call from your hometown, Ann Arbor, Michigan. Good morning for Mark Sandelow.
Yes, good morning, Steve. I hope you give me a minute. I called earlier and I was on hold for 5 minutes, but we ran out of time.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. So anyway, I'm calling because Michigan had a recall of Engler, and it was going quite well, but then at the last minute, the Republicans somehow maneuvered to keep all the signatures from Detroit out. I remember that. But I'm calling because also in Enron, wasn't there an admission that they completely tried to pay back or hurt California because they didn't vote, because they weren't voting for. So that caused the deficits and all that is because of the energy debacle. And Enron, there's 44 members of Enron in the Bush administration right now, so that would explain that. And Steve, to the question earlier, I need to respond. If people that really are concerned about the truth about the president lying, and if they're real Americans, they should watch Bill Moyer Now. He interviews one of the highest people in the administration who is a intelligence person. And he interviews this guy, and this guy is appalled. He's a Republican, and he's trying very hard not to criticize Bush in the interview, but he's aghast. He did lie. He lied on many occasions. Not only him, but Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and Rumsfeld knowingly lied, and they planned to lie to get us into that war. And something better become of this, or we have lost all credibility. And if the man in California is worried about Democrats having too much power of the independent, he better wake up. I don't think the Democrats have any power. Republicans have taken over the entire country and possibly the world. So let's not worry about Democrats having too much power. And thank you again, Steve.
Thank you for the call from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
And call from Ann Arbor, Michigan allows me to wish my father a happy Father's Day. He's probably watching in Ann Arbor, so happy Father's Day, Dad.
Where does this all go from here?
Well, this is going to go to the ballot most likely. They're 200,000 signatures away. A lot can happen. I mean, the caller from Michigan points out that a lot of shenanigans can take place to prevent this from getting to the ballot. But almost certainly at this point, this is heading to the ballot. And when it gets to the ballot, nobody knows. Arnold Schwarzenegger on the ballot? Maybe. Dianne Feinstein on the ballot? Possibly, who knows? This is going to be an election like no one has ever seen, and in a state that represents, about 1 out of 10 Americans lives in California. This is something the whole country will be watching.
We're going to open our phone lines to viewers who want to comment on this question. Is the recall effort good politics? Can you again just summarize how many states have this type of capability, and whether or not we could see more in the coming years?
Yes, it's 18 states, as I understand it, have the recall in their state constitution that allow. Now, California, it's easier to qualify. You only need something like 900,000 signatures. It's 12% of the people who voted in the previous elections. Most states require a higher threshold. California's huge, so it wouldn't be so many votes. But most states, I think 25% of the people who voted in the previous election signing a petition can get a recall on the ballot. It has not been done in 83 years, 82 years back in North Dakota. It's a very, very, very uncommon procedure. Arizona was headed towards doing it, towards Governor Meekum back in the 1980s. Meekum had broken some laws, and before he could get a recall on the ballot, he was actually impeached. So often the process overtakes itself. It's very, very uncommon, but Proposition 13 proved that initiative movements that begin in California often spread throughout the country, and there's certainly thought that if California is successful, maybe we'll start seeing this in other state houses.
Mark Sanlow of the San Francisco Chronicle, thanks for joining us, and we're glad we could facilitate a Father's Day wish to your dad in Michigan. So with that, we want to find out from you, not necessarily just in California, but in general, is it good